from the government. From my perspective, we're going to want to see things like flexible furlough. How do you start to taper down government spending in furlough, where the businesses and business owners that can afford to start increasing their contribution do so? How do you see a differential approach across sectors, where we know, for example, that the hospitality sector, the aerospace sector, and some other sectors are going to be hit for longer than those sectors that might be able to start to reopen in the coming months? And then also, what does the government support to those businesses look like on that sectoral basis? And it's really important that those of us on the left of politics don't fall into the trap of being attacked by the right wing for saying, oh, all you ever talk about is benefits and bailouts. Those are important parts of the economic response. But we all know we've also got to talk about economic recovery, wealth, and job creation, and emphasizing the case, which we've all now learned real time, about the new kind of social contract that exists between the state, businesses, workers, and unions. The state isn't just something that needs to get out of the way in order for economic success to happen and just keep growing. The state has an important partnership role and an important leadership role that we have to advocate for. And so then when we come to recovery, the question is, what type of recovery do we want? How do we ensure that that happens as quickly as possible? And what position does that put the UK in globally in terms of global economics as well? And there are a couple of points under that which I think are quite interesting. One of the things that I raised in the trade bill this week was the fact that British manufacturing has been overlooked for a very long time. You know, I'm a lawyer as well as a member of parliament, so of course I recognise and support the service industry, and 70-ish% of our exports are services based. But there are opportunities for us to grow across the regions and nations across the UK to bring back British manufacturing. We have great exposure in automotive and aerospace and gas turbines and a little bit in pharmaceuticals. But there are opportunities where we, with a bit of leadership from the state and partnership with business, can start to grow manufacturing, which can happen across different locations across the country. And that's one thing that I think that we need to think about. The second thing, and part of the topic for today, is the technological revolution. I mean, we're all here on Zoom as opposed to TUC in London, as we might normally be for a progress conference. One of the meetings I've been having this week are with legislators from different countries around the world who are interested in artificial intelligence regulation. And before, it was quite difficult to get everybody in a room, whereas now everyone's so used to using Zoom, it's been much easier. And I had members of Congress, members of Parliament in Canada, all the way through to legislators in Asia, across Europe and Australia and New Zealand, coming together like this to collaborate. And that's just one small example of how the speed of change around technological transformation has increased because it had to during the pandemic. But it also, again, shows the important role for the states. If we think, for example, the COVID tracing app, you know, these types of decisions and digital transformation of government ran services are being done with little accountability and oversight from Parliament. And in normal circumstances, we would want to make sure that this was being done in the right way, where we bring the public with us so that they can trust that these solutions are working. So there are some lessons to be learned, and I hope that they get learned in the context of being able to advocate for more technological transformation in the future, bringing people with us and dealing with some of the inequalities that exist around access to technology, but being able to deal with productivity and transformation of industry as a consequence. And last but not least, and evidently very, very significantly important, is the sustainable transition. You know, we all recognize that climate change is one of our biggest public policy challenges. When you compare the response from government to climate change to the response to COVID, obviously there's a very significant difference. But to my mind, that says there's more we can do on climate change, and we have the ability to do that. So whether it's about decarbonizing transport, if people are going to be working differently, thinking about the commute, how we deal with energy efficiency in our homes, how we build secure energy production and distribution, how we deal with greener travel, all of those issues should be linked into a new industrial strategy that brings some of that fiscal capacity for us to invest in the country, provide some leadership from the state, partner with business, create jobs and wealth around the whole of our United Kingdom, with a future agenda through the technological revolution that positions us well in the world, but also sets the example for a net zero and sustainable country, so that we have credibility when, for example, we're presiding over COP26, to say to other countries around the world that you can do this in a just and sustainable way that's great for your country and great for the world. So I'll leave it there. I think I'm handing over to Andrew next. Over to you, Andrew.
Cool. I'm very obedient, so will happily be handed over to. I learned in life, always follow the chair. So thank you very much to the invite for Progress to do that. For those of you who don't know, Prospect is a union. We've got 147,000 members. We're one of the professional or specialist unions, so we represent people working in engineering, in tech, in science and research, people who are at the front end of some of the tech advances that Darren's talked about, but equally people whose jobs in aviation, in manufacturing and engineering, which are really affected by what's going on at the moment. So I'm going to talk a bit about, for a couple of minutes, just about some of the bigger themes within that. Probably my first point, slightly a groupy point, which is, some of the conversations around what comes next, I think, are just as scary as the current crisis we're in at the moment. But I feel very privileged to be on a platform, a Zoom platform, with Seema and Darren, because when we look at the political challenges ahead, we actually need champions for an inclusive economy on there. And I can't think of two better champions than Darren and Seema in terms of making that case. So let me just talk a bit about where I think we're at and what some of those bigger challenges are. Since March, I think we've all experienced the economy has been turned inside out. Home working, people on furlough, the schemes Darren's already talked about. Yet in other ways, the crisis has shone a light on some of the existing problems that were already there in our economy. And what it's done is reveal some of the worst practices that underpin our economic model. It's put the stress and duress of what's been happening in our economy in place. So when people talk about, this shouldn't be about a return to business as usual, I think one of the challenges for us, and we feel it as trade unions, is not just dealing with the immediate crisis of supporting members, lobbying government, working to ensure workplaces are safe as people go back to them. It's finding the bandwidth to think about what this future recovery looks like, because there will be other people on the political terrain, from the right, from other traditions, who will be making arguments about a future which isn't as inclusive or sustainable as Darren's talked about. And I think we need to face up to the fact that our argument is based on the realization the economy wasn't working for many people before COVID. And we've seen that, whether it's the Wetherspoons owner and his desire to keep a hold of the title of Britain's worst boss in terms of how he treated his workforce. You've had some big companies asking for taxpayer bailouts, while at the same time as taking furlough and trying to seek to maintain shareholder value rather than protect jobs and taking advantage of government schemes. But bigger picture behind that, we've also seen the fragility or the imbalance of power within our labour market. So the reliance of many businesses and industries on the willingness of self-employed workers to shoulder a huge part of the financial risk. And now that, that has completely been pulled apart. For our members in our BEC2 sector, particularly in the creative industries, that whole risk of being working in the creative industries has been transferred onto individuals who are freelancers, many of whom are still excluded from government schemes. And I think we've got to think about that balance of where does the burden of risk and innovation fit within the economy. We've also seen the lack of resilience in the just-in-time model. Where the long supply chains, the outsourcing on outsourcing has created an economy which very early on in this crisis struggled to meet some of those demands we had about how we get together. Crisis has also brought into sharp relief new and emerging challenges at work. So Darren's talked about one of the areas I'm passionate about that my union looks at, which is the rapid increase, the acceleration of technology, particularly surveillance technology in the workplace. So there was an article in a paper a couple of weeks ago that talked about monitoring tags being put on high-vis jackets. Now look, high-vis jackets are really important. For a long while, you've been able to have monitoring devices on them, which means if there is some bad chemicals in your area, it can alert a worker about it. What we're seeing now in the name of safety is things like wearable devices, which can, in the instant, tell people about social distancing, but also give power to employers to know when you're moving, to know where you are, to know who you're congregating with. Are you with the good workers or bad workers? There's a whole crossover between data and big technology, which in the midst of a crisis about public health, where we all want to feel safe, is actually setting some boundaries. And very much, I've been concerned that we may be setting precedent in a crisis which will radically alter the nature of power in the workplace and workspaces around it. And then finally, we know that the hit from the coming recession will fall hardest on those already experiencing the hard edge of our economic model in low-paid, precarious work. So there's a number of things I think we should be thinking about how we get this right for the future. And I've actually drawing this from some work we've been doing and an essay I've done for a great collection of essays on our other national debt. How do we repay the people who have worked hardest and us as a set of communities in this crisis to build an economy that's fit for us? And I will share the link to it on Twitter shortly for those who are interested. And in that, I've said there's 5 big questions we should be thinking about. Firstly, how do we value jobs? We have seen a radical change in perception in the media about those jobs that now mean value. It is not captains of industry we now laud. It is actually carers, NHS workers, retail workers, the people who deliver to our doors. If we value them in a crisis, how do we create value for jobs which sometimes did not have economic value in the past? And how do we challenge that? Secondly, there's a question of what do we mean by good work? We have seen jobs change. Just having people working from home may be useful. It may give flexibility, but what is the quality of work we've got? What does it mean working from home? What does it mean traveling to an office? All of those big changes of, for us on the centre left, for those of us in the labour movement, we should be talking about good work, not just jobs, but making it good. And what does that look in a future economy, coming with Brexit, coming out of this crisis? Thirdly, Darren's point about industrial strategy. How do we create an economic transition that lifts everyone up? I think there's real dangers there will be industries particularly hit and geographies particularly hit. And this needs to be a recovery that isn't just about the City of London, isn't just about certain parts of the economy, but actually really embeds the regional industrial policies that Labour has championed before. How do we define our work in a rapidly world of changing technology? And then, which we talked about. And then finally, the final question I think is really important is, how do we create and build on this sense of social partnership? Do you know what? The government has listened to unions in this crisis. We've had to bang at doors and we've had to get through those doors to make that, and it hasn't listened to all of us. But there's a reason why Germany, our Scandinavian cousins, Norway have achieved better results quicker in this crisis, and that's because the room where decisions are made have always involved not just business and government, but business, governments and unions. And I think there's a real chance that when we think about rewriting the rules, it isn't just policy outcomes, it's how we do policy. This needs to be the birth of a moment of social partnership again and making it work for the future. But my final point, Darren, is just to go back to the earlier point, we're not the only people having this conversation. You've already seen the likes of Ian Duncan Smith and others say, do you know what? Gender pay gap, why do we need that? That's a burden on businesses coming out of it. 45 days notice when you're making redundancies, that's really problematic. That's red tape. So we've got to make sure we're defending the important things we value as well as creating new things. Some days that scares me because that's a huge task, but other days in the company of the likes of Darren and Seema, I'm full of hope. So I know we've got politicians, a leadership in a party, and a set of unions who are up for that challenge. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you so much, and your flattery is always welcome. Over to Seema.
Thank you very much, Darren. And I want to just say how pleased I am that you are also now the chair of the Bay Select Committee, because I do think that in this strange world of Parliament, the select committees, which have been an important point of challenge for the government, are going to play an incredibly important role as we think more across Parliament for how we tackle the challenges we face. And it is a great pleasure to join the panel along with you and Andrew, because I think what we are seeing is, I think, coalescing of some ideas now that are really important as a base and as a set of principles on which Labour builds its narrative, but also its constructive challenge and opposition to where the government has been and where it's going. I want to also thank Progress, because I think this is a really timely discussion and was very helpful to me as we're thinking now as where I think the next interventions are also going to need to be around what's going to come next for employment, and for how we think about people's jobs post furlough. And planning for that. And that's got to be a very serious strategic conversation, which in my view, the government hasn't really started in earnest. And I am worried that there's going to be another space in which the government is behind the curve. I do want to just make just a comment on a couple of points that you've raised as well before making some introductory remarks of my own. The first being around the concept of a new social contract, which I think is incredibly vital, because it is a space in which the Tories are absolutely not in their comfort zone. And sort of psychologically and philosophically, they are torn between those who have been taken a rather sort of right-wing Republican sort of line of get back to work, and and are we overstating our response to lockdown, or to the health crisis, and this sort of seesaw between the health crisis and managing that and the economic impact is now a space in which there are, I think we're clearly seeing internal battles going on. I think it is, I think it's important to remember as well how the Prime Minister very nearly lost his life. And I am worried in the context of that we could see a sort of rush back to work led by this, I think self-interested view of the Tory party of needing a good crowd behind Boris Johnson, but with MPs who need to self-isolate as well. That actually what this could do, where we could be asked to vote effectively in a long line with 2 meters between us, seeing that 600 MPs could be in each other's slipstream as we all slowly walk into the voting lobby. I mean, these are utterly unrealistic in my view in terms of safety in the current climate. And so I think the question about how we return to work and how Parliament sets a good example and a responsible example is an important part of how we can see that those principles with other employers too, because the balance of power point is a really important one. Those that have been, in a sense, bearing the brunt of the inequalities as well that COVID has exposed. Rachel Reeves went through some of those extremely effectively. But if I can just pick up on one extra point, it has been the disproportionate impact in terms of unemployment on those in sort of less stable work, those at the front line, the impact that young people are feeling, and how that impact on young people's employment won't just be a matter of 6 months to a year. You've got a generation of 3 or 4 years of young people who are at university or at school who are unsure about what their qualifications are going to be and how they're going to move into the next stage, how they're going to move out of studying and into the workplace, whether they're 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 or 21. And I think the support that we're going to need to see from the state for young people's employment, especially as we're going to be looking to young people as well to help lead us out of the economy as a generation that is likely to be at lower risk, but also to make sure the workplace is safe. So we've got to now think ahead in terms of what our response has to be for an employment strategy as part of the exit strategy, and how that has got to recognise the unfairness both in terms of the workplace now, but also where the unemployment hit is going to be. Some of that data has started to be exposed in the new figures this week as well. And we've heard very recently about the 62 billion record borrowing that was for April. That's 3 times greater than 2008. We've got 8 million on furlough. We've been pushing, and I think I'm so proud of the Labour Party for pushing and being ahead of the curve on the next phase of furlough arguments as well, because we're going to see in some areas, some sectors coming back more quickly than others. But others like aviation that my constituency is particularly impacted by is going to be part of a national story as well, because if you take Heathrow, in the surrounding boroughs around Heathrow, we know that 200,000 people have been furloughed. Not all of those jobs are going to be there when people go back, at least not for, what could happen in phases over the next year in terms of unemployment and how it hits. 4,000 already made redundant. A lot of people who work at Heathrow are shift workers, where you've got parents that manage their household incomes and are just about managing, if that, with a parent going out for the first 12 hours and there's the next parent going out for the next 12 hours, and they overlap for an hour in the middle of the day. That is not uncommon for many in my constituency. So we've got to be thinking much more seriously and realistically about how we transition to the economy that's going to come, but also how we think about what the interim phase is in the sort of medium term, because whereas some sectors will bounce back, others will have a longer tail. So does that tail get filled with a longer furlough, and is that for a year? Is that for 2 years? Do we see employers paying and tapering in terms of the contribution? Do we see specific and more tailored and targeted packages for different sectors? Do we see that being more conditional? But also, do we see there being other ways in which you may be able to have creative ways of job retention? One example being that BALPA has initiated discussions around the pilots union, where we've been having regular discussions as West London MPs as well, where they are looking to an arrangement they've had with the RAF not just more recently, but historically, and looking to try and save some jobs that are at risk by transferring them to the RAF, but with the guarantee of being able to come back to those airlines in the future as demand picks up. So the concept of job retention beyond the job retention scheme, and where there could be some exchanges, where there could be, underpinned by work with trade unions and fairness and re-engagement clauses going into to contracts that Unite has also been talking about. These are new concepts that can help alongside thinking and reflect and seeing what other countries have been doing, whether that's around short-time working or other measures. So job retention, job creation, but also where we need job guarantees and learning from what's worked in the past. Because if we look at what happened after the, not just 2009, but we can go back over the, the last 40 years, which is exactly what we are doing, to what has worked, whether it was under the Tories or under Labour, to see what impact those problems had, because the programs had. So the Future Jobs Fund that Labour brought in after the 2008 downturn was seen as having one of the best returns on investment, and saving a huge amount for in terms of with young people, not just in terms of reduced benefits, but also in terms of increased work and increased tax take. And that scheme was evaluated by the DWP itself, as well as by the DWP Select Committee in 2012, as having had a positive impact, even though the scheme effectively was cancelled by David Cameron for nothing more than ideological and petty party political reasons in 2011. So the lessons of what works is really important for how we build that into to how we move forward. I want to say a couple of other points as well about the resilience, because this pandemic has really exposed the way in which we have a social security system that is not fit for purpose. This is a sort of a minimal provision, and the assumption that people, if you make life just a sort of marginally difficult for people, that they will somehow, not be lazy and go and find work. Well, I think we have to have some reality checks about what it actually means for struggling families, and what the consequence has been, both in terms of a rise of poverty under the Tories, particularly child poverty, and what that's meant for where we are now. So the lack of resilience has been exposed, and also the lack of protections that people have in their own family reserves, where we've seen that people going into the crisis of 2008 had higher levels of household savings than they do now, and how there's a system that seems to, perhaps more than it should, in my view, penalise people for having savings. And I think I think this has shone a new light on how we need to support people with a fit for purpose and fair safety net, and that does support people being in work, but also where, you know, for all sorts of reasons and not due to their own fault, that they may be out of work, and having a fair deal as part of that new social contract. And I think that's important because we've seen, not just for the workplace, but how COVID-19 has impacted children. And I think from the point of view of a broader economic analysis, we need to look at that. Some of the work that I've been doing locally has been around children and their access to their online school. And I want to draw a comparison to how seriously we took absence, and the government was taking absence, and teachers' absence from school, whether it was 2 days, ahead of a school holiday that, parents took children on holiday, and it was seen to impact their learning. Now the government seems to be incredibly relaxed, in my view, in terms of the lack of speed of response to the connectivity challenge. And when I first had a head teacher ask me about who the courier company was that I introduced to them last year at an event, I asked why. This was at the start of lockdown. Because they needed to courier homework to children that couldn't access the online classroom. And so the tech divide is actually creating a divide between children who are already between the haves and the have-nots, where those that cannot access their online classrooms are going to do worse, and also have a different shared experience when they do go back to school, and a reduced ability to use online tools for their own learning. So, we've tried to plug some of the gap with a laptops donation scheme locally. But, our estimate just from phoning around to head teachers was that 1,000 secondary school children in one London borough did not have access to a laptop or to the internet. And that was not including primary school issues, where primary school head teachers have said, if you get more laptops donated, can we have them too now? So some of those issues of technology are also hidden at the moment. But I want to make a few points about where Labour should be on technology, because the Labour Party is in many ways a byproduct of the technological developments of the Industrial Revolution and the developments in manufacturing and production in the 19th century. The unions that founded the party were active in mining, steel, and iron, and jobs associated as well with global trade. And with and to make sure the Labour Party stays relevant to where the economy is going, which is where I think we will show that we've got different and better answers to what we need to do next. How we lead, how we get a fair outcome from the fourth industrial revolution is a really critical part of what we need to do, and to work with unions, but also to look at how we support the unions, who I think are going to play an increasing role in the future, because people like who are represented by Prospect, where Andrew works, we know that we've got 27+ million people in the workplace, but we've got about 6 million who are members of trade unions. And I think we've got to look at how we grow that, and also how we also understand the reality of that, because last week's polling showed that almost 4 in 10 of those in trade unions would vote Tory. So we've got to think about how we're sort of adding, seeing as the Labour Party is sort of adding answers to the challenges that we face, as well as being able to comment and challenge what the Tories are doing. I think going forward, we've got also just an analysis that can look at what technology has brought, both in terms of necessity, opportunity, and risk to where we are. Because in terms of necessity, we would not be able to be working in the way we are without some of the developments we've seen, even through Zoom, which is a relatively new company, but I think has transformed the ability to both work and engage from home socially. Secondly, I think the necessity of track and trace, some of those technological developments, and also the speed with which vaccines have got to be developed. Those are, those are products of how a state needs to engage with industry, where we've seen a lack of resilience again because of the withdrawal of a lot of regional infrastructure from the government that broke down a lot of what the Labour Party had in place. But I think in terms of opportunities, where we talk about job creation, we've got to see technology and green industry as a big part of that. How do we invest and skill people up? How do we build that into a new partnership with HE, FE and our schools, where there could be opportunities in the next 6 to 9 months where We know there's a jobs gap between the jobs that are available and the numbers seeking work, to allow for reskilling and upskilling, but also avoid de-skilling. So on all of those fronts, job creation, job guarantee, and job retention, I think we've got to think, what's the opportunity? How do we invest and use technology? But also, how do we manage the risks, both the downsizing that might come from jobs being replaced through AI and other means, which I think COVID-19 has accelerated the digital take-up in the workplace. How do we make sure, from a social contract point of view, we put the boundaries around that? And how do we make sure that we make the technology the servant of progress and not be not be the master? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Seema. And I think that was an exquisite example as to why we're blessed to have someone like Seema in the role in our shadow cabinet, who is miles ahead from what the government are thinking and talking about, and reminding all of us why we desperately want to be in government during these times. So I'll hand over to Martha. We've got about 20 minutes, so it's a good chunk of time. And Martha will call out some questions, and then we'll give a go at answering them.
Lovely, thank you. I think if we start off with a question from Andy Straw from London. He said, I work for a large FTSE 100 company where life has gone on as normal, and also am the trustee of a small charity which shut down completely and furloughed staff with no sign of when they can return. What thoughts do you have about supporting one without breaking the other?
Shall I kick off on that one, and then if colleagues want to come in, and then we'll rotate who goes first, if that's all right. From my perspective, you know, and I've worked in FTSE 100 companies as well as smaller businesses in the past as well. You know, big companies don't just operate in their own ecosystem. They're part of complex supply chains. They rely a lot on SMEs, and they rely a lot on their local economy as well as their national and international economy. So if any FTSE CEO were to say to me, well, look, we're fine, I'm not really bothered about the rest of it, it shows that they don't really understand the market in which they are operating. And some of the points that Seema's mentioned are really important, because of course, if you're a big company and you're planning your strategy for the next 5 to 10 years, you need the workers with the skills in order to be able to do that. And one of the real risks that we have is the scarring on the economy and the labour market as a consequence of this recession if we don't put the measures in place that Seema and Andrew have been talking about, because you will have young people, especially school leavers as well, who will have lost the opportunity to develop their skills and their experience in the roles that they might normally have had. And so when people then start to retire at the other end, you have people coming through that haven't had the opportunities to develop their skills in a productive manner that's of benefit to companies. And so that's why I said to the CBI when I was guesting on the DWP Select Committee this week, you know, big businesses have got as much a role to play as government in co-investing in future skills for the labour market. Now, that might be a new deal type program that Seema's talked about, where you co-invest with businesses, because it's much easier to train people in the workplace as opposed to trying to train them when they become unemployed and go back to their homes across the whole country. But it might also be a question around the kind of devolved economy. I think I saw Craig Cheney on here earlier, who's the Deputy Mayor for Finance for Bristol, and is leading the City Economic Recovery Board on behalf of the Mayor of Bristol. Craig waving, hi Craig. And that's a real example of devolved leadership. But the bottom line is that we still then need people in Bristol to ask the Treasury for money to be able to do stuff. I would much rather local leaders in Bristol who are doing a really good job are able to either raise their own money locally or be able to give in a pot of money which they can spend in the way that they know best in their local economies. And that works for big businesses as well. You know, in Bristol, we've got, you know, BT, Airbus, GKN, Rolls-Royce, you know, all of these big businesses, multinational businesses. But local people know the local labour dynamics, they know the commuter issues, they know the skills provision and the skills delivery capacity, and how they can invest locally in partnership with big businesses and SMEs to make the best of this. So I think you can balance the two, but it goes back to that point in my opening remarks about the kind of new social contract relationship between the state, businesses, and by extension, you know, public sector and third sector as well, where there is gainful and important employment roles in those sectors, but also workers and unions to work together in partnership in what's going to be a very, very difficult economic recovery to get this right. Seema, did you want to come in on the question?
Yes, I will make a couple of comments. I think on this, I've also worked in 2 large city firms in the past, and I think we can't guarantee that we know where the joblessness is going to come in the future, because different sectors can be hit in different ways, and some of this unemployment is going to come in waves, and our response has got to be in phases about what we see as the short-term response and the medium and longer term. So, I think our strategy for for the next kind of 5 to 10 years is going to be really important. I think the second thing is how larger companies are going to be part of the job creation effort, because this is going to require us to, in my view, think in the way Labour has said before as well, about what are the kind of missions that we get around as a nation, and how are we going to find that important part and contribution for large companies, for where the state chooses and needs to invest, and where there's going to be a part of the strategy being with the devolved economies and local government as well. Let's not forget that some of the most successful labour market strategies are those that are led locally, because local government will know its local labour market and be dealing with its local unemployed. And we've got to speed up this time, the time between when people come forward for assistance if they've lost their job, to get back into work, because that period of unemployment can have its own knock-on effects, psychologically and otherwise. We also know, I should say, that from some research done, there's about 2/3 of young people apparently are not engaging with the system. So even the numbers we have that I've had from my constituency of 750 young people 18 to 24 unemployed could well be a woeful underestimate. So I think the role of large companies and their responsibility is important. In terms of the point that's also made about the sort of mobility of those in larger companies to be able to go abroad and be sent abroad, well, we've all experienced that. Some of that may well be changed as a result of a sort of refocus on a domestic production in light of some of the challenges of COVID-19 in some key areas. But I don't think we're going to be able to get away from an international supply chain. The question about what COVID-19 does to the assumption of being able to travel abroad, even for the next few years, if you could be a cycle of lockdowns, is likely to change what companies do. So I wouldn't want to say that there isn't going to be risk either now or in the future, because we just don't know so much about the virus. The last point on charities, look, I think the way the government's responded on charities has been just heartbreaking. They were far too slow at setting up support, and that was a big push led by Labour, but cross-party as well. The experience I've had locally is that support is far too slow at getting through. So what we've got to do is make sure that we keep up the resilience of the third sector. I think that's been another lesson learned, another place in which infrastructure was really broken down and taken down to the skeletons by the Tories. And I think hopefully there's going to be cross-party support for building that up again.
Andrew, your union represents some of these big FTSE multinationals. Anything you want to add from your perspective about their kind of view on this stuff?
Yeah, just say I think it's a really good question. We see it, or I see it weekly through some of the big employers in energy, in BT, in telecoms, where we represent. I see it personally wearing another hat, sitting on the board of Stonewall, and what's happening to the third sector and charities there. I think there's 2 points I'd add in addition to what you and Seema have said, Darren, which are the 10-year legacy we're dealing with and the 30-year legacy we're dealing with. The 10-year legacy is that we're trying to respond to this crisis on the back of 10 years of austerity, where the state has been cut back so hard that it's been difficult to come back, difficult to respond to that. I'll give you a good example. We represent the inspectors in the Health and Safety Executive, which the government says are really important, and have said they want to do inspections and check the workspaces are safe when people return to them. They've given 14 million to say they will invest in that, but in the last 10 years, they've cut the budget by over 100 million. So there were fewer inspections and fewer trained inspectors even before this crisis. And all of a sudden, we now know they're really important. So how do we get that balance right? And that's not saying it's a blank checkbook. It's saying there's got to be a serious discussion about the role of the state in doing that. The 30 years legacy is from the 1980s onwards. We have allowed our labour market institutions to atrophy. Trade unions have been locked out of decisions by successive Tory governments, but also the business engagement side of how do businesses and unions and government engage with each other. If you look at the regional policy structures in Germany, you look at the social partnership in Sweden or Norway, there is a much better set of institutions that deals with unemployment and people who fall through the nets, that deals with childcare and making better policy, that enables business to make sensible conversations with unions happen so that we're all in this together. And unless we have a focus on rebuilding the regional state, looking at what local government and other tiers of government does, but actually seeing that as a partnership approach, we're going to find it really difficult to respond to crises like this in the future.
Thanks, Andrew. Martha, next question, please.
Brilliant, thank you very much. The next question is from Lisa Baines from Sheffield, who has asked, have we been too reliant on imports for our everyday needs? And how do we reframe our economy going forwards to ensure that local businesses are better supported and valued?
Andrew, do you want to come in on that one? We'll go back around the other way.
Yeah, I don't necessarily want to comment on imports and things coming in. I think that's probably beyond my brief and is a much bigger issue. But I do think it talks to the issue of a resilient economy. And I think some of the problems we've seen with the desire to drive down costs in procurement, the way government procures its own services, some of the levels of outsourcing and the move to a just-in-time economy means that at every level of the supply chain, there is very little margin for flexibility to build in value in other areas, which means when you have a mega crisis like this, things stop very quickly. And I think we've got to look at how we value the supply chain differently. And some of that's about how we value jobs itself. How do we create something which is sustainable? I think I would caution against a debate that risks playing into some of the populism of the right about exports in other countries. I think having an open economy and trading of the world is both a good thing and it's really important for jobs. You know, there are lots of jobs based on good investment by good employers. Sometimes they need a bit of shaping, and that's where regulation and unions come in. But we've got to be a trading nation. We've got to build up manufacturing, and that will need customers elsewhere. So I think it's resilience and it's value within that. And if we can address those questions, we might deal with what I think the questioner was getting to in terms of some of the problems we face.
Thanks, Andrew. Seema?
Yes, thanks very much. I think this is a much more complex debate than sometimes we give attention to. I think there's a few things in terms of our kind of status as both. I think the island as well as the international trading nation. Imports are the other side of the coin of exports, and I don't think we can be in a position where we think that imports aren't as good, but exports are sometimes good, somehow good for British companies. We've got to understand this in terms of also a wider geopolitical context, and nations engaged economically is part of what keeps us together in peace. And I think it's one of the real successes post-war of what's happened under the what's become the European Union and went through certain stages before that, but also where I think Europe still has to be, and how we've still got to be seeing Europe as part of the heart of how we trade with local nations to us, but also where we might see our sort of place in the world. And productivity also comes from how you keep progress going, and also the competitiveness of our industry across the world. So I think we've got to see this in a broader picture. Prices can also be kept low if you've if you're also looking at international competitiveness, and that's prices for families as well, for what they buy. And one example will be food imports. So I'm in an area with a very high ethnic minority population. 40% of my constituents are probably South Asian, and they see at the moment for a lot of vegetables from South Asia, a 4% increase in the price that they're paying, and that is really hitting those families hard. So so I think but the point that we are needing to really readdress is where we haven't had a view about our national industry and national investment, our manufacturing in Britain and investing in that, because in a sense we've focusing on what is the cheapest isn't always focusing on what's the best and what's sustainable. So that's why I think the conversations we're having about jobs and growth and how we're going to invest in industries here has got to be aligned to how we're skilling people up and creating the opportunity to engage in the future, and how technology may well play a big part in that, in terms of the advantage and opportunity for those who we know also with disabilities who have in a sense been pushed out and isolated from the labour market, and the challenge of closing the disability gap. Well, technology could bring a much greater opportunity to how we think inclusively and for the industry of the future, and also how we then focus on exports that are going to be and the creation of exports and trade relations that are going to help with British companies for the future.
Thanks, Seema. The only thing that I'll add very quickly is that of course, our primary obligation is to get the British economy right for British people. But we on the left are also internationalists, and I'm sure all agree that the majority developing world, you can't just kind of leave them hanging after this economic collapse, because they don't have the levers that we have around fiscal policy space. We've just been able to issue £350 billion worth of gilt in order to borrow to invest. There are very, very few countries in the world that have the ability to do that. And I certainly take the view, and I'm sure we all do, as people who think about collective responsibility, that we all benefit across the world when everybody is doing better. And the UK, as one of the richest countries in the world, that will want to import things from other countries, is a really important part of the investment that goes into other countries around the world. And if we just create everything ourselves and close our boundaries and take a protectionist approach, as some on the right wish to do so, you're essentially leaving a lot of countries around the world even worse off than they currently are. And I think ultimately that's bad for us, as well as the West as well. So you have to do two things. You have to say, what are the kind of strategic bets that we want to take in the economy? So for example, in the trade bill that I mentioned earlier, I learned that the only two new exports that we've added to our product basket in the last 10 years have been leather items and goat fat and goat, bovine and something else fat. Now, for those of us that think about the British economy, and we think, well, actually, if 70% of our new exports in the last 10 years have been animal fat, surely we can do something a bit kind of more higher value than that and kind of, better work-wise from that. And it's because we've not said, for example, actually, we're pretty good at electronics and there's more we can do in the UK and we can co-invest and create centres of excellence in other parts of the country. And we should do that. And where there's an issue of national security that we want to make sure, for example, in steel or in other industries where we want domestic capacity because of the security issue, we do that. But actually on other stuff, we want to create the opportunities for other countries to prosper as well. So I think, Martha, I've got 3 minutes on the clock until we automatically get boosted out. So we can try a very quick third question with short answers, if you think that's sensible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're all, I think it might be being kicked out at 1:15, so we've got a few more minutes. We thought, if I bring in Nigel Harper, I think he had a question about 4-day weeks. Nigel, I've just unmuted you.
Oh, hi, yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I was just wondering about the momentum for a 4-day week now. Given the sort of 80%, 20% with the furlough, it could be the other way around, that you could help sort of people who would be struggling on a 4-day week by giving a sort of 20% furlough to transition the economy into a 4-day week, and what people thought about that.
So the 4-day week, we've seen Jacinda Ardern, for example, start a debate on this in New Zealand, who is a very successful Labour leader. There's not many of them around the world at the moment, but she's great. And I think both in terms of economic recovery and the partnership with citizen, state and employers, but also the technology question play into this policy issue around 4-day week. One of the things that I've really benefited from during this lockdown is the ability to see my children much more than I normally do, and that's been great. And it's made me realise how little I actually saw them beforehand because I was just working all of the time. And I'm sure other people, if they've not got to the end of the tether having children around them all the time, kind of share that type of view. And you could see how you could end up in a position where if the state is partnering with businesses around the recovery, the benefit of that and the ability in order to transition, business models and cost models is a 4-day week conversation. When that is coupled with technological investment that increases productivity, or we're starting to deliver goods and services in new and digital ways. So I think we're kind of on the journey towards that type of conversation. We know for a long time workers in the UK have worked much higher numbers than workers across the European Union. We know the British economy has been unproductive for a very long time compared to, for example, France and especially Germany. And I think if we're now in this position where with business and the state, we have the ability for significant investment and transformation in the economy, that the 4-day week conversation is something that might come through that in a very positive way, as the one where everybody goes, oh, that sounds, you know, frightfully socialist and we're all going to lose money and profit. Seema.
Sorry, I was on mute there. I think there's just to add a couple of points to what you've said, Darren. I think, you know, these are questions that are being thought about across the world, because I think this comes back to my point about job retention. You know, if you've got job creation, you also need to have the job retention of what we've got now. And the furlough is a sort of is a first step, but it's not going to be the end. This is a longer term journey with COVID-19. I do think what's important for us to also be thinking about alongside that is that this has got to be about income as well. And I think the fair wage and fair pay for particularly those that are on lower incomes is now rising as a political priority, and it's absolutely got to. I think the issue that we also have got to recognise is that the difference between 80% and 100% of your pay can be the difference between making ends meet at the end of the month and not, for many on low incomes, and certainly has been the case for many in my constituency. And what that means is that is a creeping rise in household debt. So I think the choices we make have got to be in line with how we're thinking holistically about supporting people, about a fair social security system, about a proper partnership between the state and employers in the national interest. And if we can do all of that and we have a constructive dialogue, then I think we can go a long way to getting people through in a much more inclusive way through this period and into the future with rules rewritten. I just want to make this last point, which is that I think we've got a shorter gap than we might think. Maybe it's the next 6 months in which Labour's got to work hard to try and shift the narrative, because the decisions we make now are absolutely going to be the base on which the next phase, you know, post-September and the phase after that we're going to have to be thinking about for, say, employment and economy purposes. You know, you've got to set the foundations in both your story, your narrative, and the policies that you're putting in place now to build appropriately. And that's why the voice of progress and all of us through the party and through us in Parliament is going to be very important, to keep a very clear focus and challenge on the government, but also to try and steer the direction as a whole Parliament, as much as taking the direct challenge as the opposition.
Thanks. And Andrew.
I absolutely agree with that point, Seema. I've just seen the brilliant Ken Penton, who's on the room, has just made the same point in the chat, which is, you know, I'm a big skeptic of the pendulum will swing our way. We haven't necessarily seen it previously, and for any of us who are progressives, we've got to earn the trust of people to take part, you know, that we are the kind of people they should engage with around what this future looks like. And it's going to be the fight of our lives coming out of a really serious crisis and recession to make progressive ideals the one that triumph. Historically, we don't have a great record. We have episodes, but we don't have long-term arc of doing that. So how do we do that? Very quickly on the question, you know, the UK, we tend to work harder and we have worse productivity. That is the underlying problem of our economy. And if we can solve that, we can actually begin to deal with the question of the 4-day week, you know, and that's what it's about. Actually, if technology helps improve our productivity, we need to make sure that workers and families share in the benefits of that. We did some big research in January where we spoke to 7,500 of our members. 3/4 of them did not think they would be involved in discussions with their employers about how technology will change their work. Again, 3/4 of them thought they would not share any of the benefits. If this is top-down imposed change, or if technology is just used to ratchet up shareholder value and none of those benefits have gone to workers, we're going to have a really difficult future for us. How do we make this good for all of us? And how do we use this moment of the coming together of the nation in this crisis to define kindness and empathy in the kind of economy we want in the future?
Thank you, Andrew. And then I think the final 30 seconds, I'll just finish up by saying that this has been a super interesting debate, and it's been great to see all of your questions in the chat box. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get through all of them, but what it does show, I think, is that for those of us on the left, the time is now to be making these arguments. The time is now to try to seize the opportunity to create an economy and a world that we want to see in the future. And we've got to, all pull together in the same direction to try to make that happen at every level of our activism. So thank you so much to all of you for taking part. Thank you to my excellent speakers, Andrew and Seema, who have been fantastic advocates for these types of issues. And thank you to Martha for making sure that I didn't hang up or something and we got the questions through. As Martha said, don't click the leave room button when it comes up any moment now. You can either click return to the main room or just wait, and you should be moved automatically back to the main session. So thanks so much for now, and I look forward to speaking to all of you again in the future. Bye-bye.